Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this discussion today. We are hoping to have a lively overlook and discuss what is happening in work culture around hybrid and remote work being forced back into the office, and what it kind of says as far as the effects on communities, but also what is happening in leadership and work, that this is the current outcome that is happening, this push in large leadership of corporations. So before we get started, I would love for everyone to just introduce themselves and share a little bit about themselves. So I know I asked each of you if you would share who you are, one identity that you believe is important to this discussion that you'd like to share with us. And then if there's anything really exciting in your life that's happening that you would like to bring attention to, please do that. I am Yeruwelle De Rouen. I am the founder of a EBI consulting firm that works in organizational healthy culture development through restorative design. An identity that is very important to me is a professional working woman. My entire life, I've been negotiating what it means to be a female in the professional world, as I wanted to build a career and my own legacy of work. And I think that that continues to be a question, and it's important to me today. And one thing that I'm really excited about is that I am excited to share with the world a free guide to help build more restorative meetings and better outcomes within meetings so that they are actually useful and efficient, build relationship, and get to clear decision making. Just for the sake of moving on, Bonnie, I'm going to call on you if that's okay.
Sure. I'm Bonnie. I manage the business recruiting team for a tech company called Zapier, 100% remote company. So definitely excited to talk about that piece, and then also create content around like workplace culture, recruiting, hiring practices, things like that. And I'm also, have a background in education and nonprofits. So lots of variety in there of things I talk about. And in terms of identities, I think the first one I think about is that of like a caregiver. I have both a 2-year-old and I provide some support to my mother who has some medical issues as well. And so that definitely plays a big role in how I show up in the workplace.
I could go next. Hi, I'm Khushboo. I am a diversity inclusion program manager at Neurodiversity Pathways. We're a small social impact program at the Goodwill of Silicon Valley, and we work with neurodivergent job seekers to help them gain meaningful employment. We also work with companies to provide trainings on improving their neuro-inclusivity and improving psychological safety. An identity that's really important to me is being a neurodivergent coach, because I think that that is a unique thing that I bring to my coaching experience for the neurodivergent people that I support. And I'm really excited to talk about this discussion and how it affects neurodivergent people in their day-to-day lives, and also how they navigate employment.
Well, I guess it's me then. My name's Tahitia. I am a small business owner of a diversity, equity, and inclusion company that focuses on content creation, coaching, and consulting, mainly around the space of health and wellness, particularly around equity issues. I tend to focus on social determinants and approaching it from that aspect. I work with small to mid-sized businesses and individuals. I tend to have a very social justice oriented perspective as I approach this, just because my own life, I have a lot of skin in the game, as they say. For myself, the one question that was asked was, what's an identity that's important to you? And there seem to be so many when you talk about this conversation. But for myself, it's probably two that are intersecting: that of being a Black woman and a mother, a caretaker. So there are some differences there. And I just really felt myself grow, right? Once I went work from home, and the pandemic was not why I went work from home. I've been work from home for a few years. So I was excited to talk about this conversation. One thing that's in my orbit that I am also sort of excited about is I started a new podcast strictly focusing on health equity issues because I wanted to talk to people who might be doing things that they didn't realize were health equity issues. So I'm excited about doing something like that.
Well, thank you all for sharing. Thank you for being here. I think that this is the start of a discussion like this, right? Because there's so many more perspectives, needs, experiences that are a part of this, but this is, I think, a good place to start. So thank you for joining. Let's dive right in. So we wanted to start by just talking about this forced return to work that is happening. There are huge corporations, some of the most well-known corporations in the United States are forcing their employees to go back, which include places like Apple. That's been one of the large discussions because there's a lot of pushback from their employees about this. And I think that this starts to bring us to larger discussions of what is happening in the world, right? Because these are models for what is happening in larger, or excuse me, in smaller corporations, organizations, cities, things like that. So I wanted to start and hear from each of you. What do you think this forced return is signaling to us? What is happening in the current situation of work? What do you think this is signaling about our leaders of industry at the moment? And I'd welcome anyone who would like to jump in.
So I have two thoughts about this. One is we know some of this is related to the pandemic and having to pivot for that. But another piece is that those who were hesitant to return often looked like myself and the other people on the call. And I feel like it is sort of a reaction to the independents that may have grown up in this group, to seeing themselves being valued more than they might have been before. Especially for perhaps women identified bodies, it is almost easier to be really sincere about your feelings about a project via distance than when you're face to face with someone, because we've been taught, we've been socialized to be a little quieter. And there is no quiet really on a Zoom call or these type of networks, because you have to get your voice heard some way. And you learn that quickly. So that was one of my thoughts about that. And the other piece was the real estate piece, right? So you have all these businesses that rent all of these places who probably thought more people would want to come back. And now they're seeing that those places are empty. And the only reason I think that is because I worked for a global company, and we decided for cost saving purposes, because a lot of people worked most of the days at home, to shift those who could remote. And what we learned was that it cleared out about 2 or 3 floors on the building that we were in. So what does that look like? And how do you renegotiate those contracts? And how do you not lose money as you send people home, where you're probably gaining money in some aspects, but you're not seeing it right away, especially if you're looking to recoup from, because it's the tech companies, right, that are doing this. And I do want to say the tech companies have not perhaps been the ones working remotely first. So maybe the guide is not these super large companies, but who is doing it well? And did they learn lessons from them? Because there are companies that have been remote for a very long time and have great employee interactions. And so where did they get their lessons would be my question.
I feel like this is a really good point for Bonnie. And I wanted to say, I think this is something you're bringing up, Tahitia, is an issue everywhere. You know, we see this even with like what happened with schools having to go remote. There's a lot of already successful homeschooling and online school programs. They refuse to ask them how they do it. They refuse to learn from them, and it was a failure, right? So I think what you're pointing to is the most important. How do we model and learn from each other? And Bonnie, yes.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of that resonated, and I do think that there is a very real difference. Like I have worked in environments where it was like hybrid, let's say, or like you could work from home sometimes but needed to travel. And the difference of coming to a company that was designed to be remote is really stark, because you have to set up your systems differently when you can't just tell people to fly into the office for an important meeting. It's always remote. And so you have to find different ways to make sure voices are heard, make sure that things are accessible to everyone, regardless of their location, to navigate time zones. Back when I worked in a hybrid environment, there were times where I would have meetings at 6 a.m. to accommodate, other people. Here, I somehow within my workday am able to connect with colleagues in Europe and things like that. And so, it is like doable. If you're kind of set up for that. I think the other thing, when Talitha was talking about the offices, there's also the reality that a lot of these companies got really big tax breaks and incentives to have these offices, to bring people into these cities. And so they just, like, financially, it benefits them to force workers into the office. And then what that means is people that can't afford to live in those locations don't have access to those jobs. So that is just like a huge equity issue, because it kind of means, like, if you don't have the wealth to live in some of the most expensive places, which typically means, like, you don't have a lot of debt, you don't have parents you have to care for, things like that. So it just kind of makes it so that these really great high-paying jobs are only available to people who are of a certain, like, income level. And so I think that's just, like, a huge issue that this, like, return to office is driving, and that a lot of the people who are having to leave these jobs are those that just can't afford to be in a location near those offices. And so that's just another piece I think a lot about.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, one point that a lot of people don't know is that more people with disabilities are employed now than ever before, more than in over a decade. So this improvement that's happened from remote working for people with disabilities, I mean, the magnitude of that change, it's just not, you can't put a number on it. It can't be calculated, right? We were actually really impacted when COVID happened at Neurodiversity Pathways, because we used to be a fully in-person program, and we actually lost all of our funding. And as a consequence to that, we put our heads together and fully rebuilt a completely online program. But in doing so, we're now working with government organizations that don't see that as a regional service anymore, because it's online. And it impacts our services in a lot of different ways. But now, our programs are able to support people from out of state, from across the globe, right? And there are neurodivergent people who are getting access to services and supports virtually that were never possible before. So there's been a lot of really positive change in terms of disability and disability employment. But with this forced return, now it's calling to question people's ability to gain that employment greatly. And as a career strategist and a coach, I'm sitting down with my students and thinking through, how can we find a job if we're limited to public transportation? How do we figure out public transportation if you've had a traumatic experience on a train? How can you navigate, traveling 2 hours or more to get to work and it just takes away your entire life force to have to go through these things, because you can't live in the city in which your company is located because it's too expensive to live there. You can't afford a car. You don't have the amount of time to commute. You have other responsibilities, and all of these things come into play. So I think that with this forced return to, the office, we're really creating a lot of barriers for people who have suddenly not had those barriers due to COVID, and are now having to re-navigate how to figure out all these different things that you have to accommodate just in order to be employed. And so I think it brings up a lot of questions. I know I'm going off on a lot of tangents here. This is just how I speak. But I think there's something to be thought about in terms of why is it that when remote work has been working so well in terms of productivity, in terms of psychological safety, in terms of improved communication, why is it that we're going back to this? And it's not even about who's doing it well. It's about, why are we considering this if it has been led to so many other issues that we're now no longer used to having, right? So just a lot of thoughts here, but I would love to hear what you guys think about that.
I think that was very well said, the why. Go ahead, Bonnie.
I was going to say, I mean, I think that like resonates so much. And we have a neurodivergent, it's not technically an ERG, but we have a group. And I know that we're more, overrepresented at Zapier, I would say, like, compared to the general population. I don't know the stats, so I'm not really sure, but I know that there are a lot of us who identify and kind of like seek support from the group. And one of the big things that comes up is how remote work enables like people to work when they wouldn't be able to be as like productive, as effective. And then, I mean, to your point, the transportation issues, so many people have those stories. And a lot of offices are not accessible. If they are, they can be, accessible in ways that are really uncomfortable. Like, it's like, well, you can't get into the kitchen with your wheelchair, but like someone else will always be available to go in there for you, or yes, the counters are low enough, but like you'll be the only one that's able to fit in there, and then you start feeling like a burden to people, things like that I think really impact how people, like, how much more mental energy has to go to fitting in the workplace, because it's not like set up for you. And when people are allowed to be at home and that burden is off, I think they're able to just be a lot more productive and contribute so much more. And so, I mean, that's where I don't necessarily think every workplace needs to be remote, but I think giving the option so that people have choices about working in the environment where they can do their best work is what is so important to me. Because some people, that does mean an office. Like, I by no means think remote is the answer for everyone, but I think people deserve to have it as an option.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to add something, Khushboo, to something that you said that really resonated with me. It was when you talked about like the opportunities that people have, right? And it really made me think about the fact we did not know what we know now about working from home. We've often, at least as someone who's working from home prior to the pandemic, oftentimes people who worked from home were thought of as not as productive or having the easier job, or they were often on that. And I'm throwing it out here, being transparent, that they were not on the path to leadership, right? Like, because you didn't see them, they weren't on the path. Then all of a sudden pandemic happens and we see that everybody, like, more people can work from home than we think, and they can be on the path. So all of a sudden you start thinking as a person, well, why do I come into the office? Like, why am I adding an extra 2 to 4 hours of my day to get everything right-sided so that I can get into an office if this work can be done at home? So I think, at least for when I thought about this topic, a lot of that piece was in there, the access to working a better way, which if I had not been able to work remote, because I was not working for my business at that point, I would probably have had to take a medical leave, because I know I was in burnout from autism at that point, because it was just too many things. But instead, I was able to slow down. So just like you said, more disabled people are working, but more people are able to work through crises that they would have had to go home for, or they would have had to stop and not finish work. More projects get finished on time. So it's so interesting that the access piece is not a big piece of this discussion, that for those who have limited resources or different resources, we're not at all talking about, well, what's going to replace that in the office? Like, how will you handle that?
All right, I want to transition us to the next questions. I think this is a really good lead into that based on everything that you all were sharing. And I want to start by just setting a little context that, what the next question is about is, why has DEI efforts and EBI efforts not gotten us to a place where our leadership knows how to work with their employees, right? Why are we still in the same place we were in previously, where they're not asking, they are not compassionately making decisions that are accountable with their employers, or excuse me, with their employees and their staff. And they are just kind of deciding what is better for the GDP, if we're going to get real frank here, right? When we're talking about the economics of this. And I appreciate, Tahitia, you bringing that up, because that is actually, I think, one of the underpinning issues that we want to not talk about, which is that this is an economic decision. It is absolutely about the pay of the people at the top and how that pay is affected for them if they have these $1 billion buildings they just built 5 years ago sitting empty, right? I personally have always loved the study of ethics, and I got to a point in my study of ethics where I started to question, what happened to ethics, right? Like, what are those now today? Because we don't talk about them. And it became very clear to me that ethics now are economics. That is the ethical narrative that we determine on how society is built. And so I kind of want to start from that, right? If we have this economic narrative that is literally driving this decision, what does this say about our efforts that have been happening all around, that we're supposedly going to create more diversity, inclusion, and belonging? We're going to start to reflect workers, and we're actually supposed to start negating some of these, barriers, accessibility issues that all individuals in some ways have, and certain groups of people have more than others. So I'd like to just hear your opinions on that and perspectives.
I just wanted to say, I think we need to stop moving away from the business case fully on diversity and focusing on the hard case and just treating people the way you want to be treated, like going back to the basics, right? Having compassion for someone else's experience and being curious, right? In our organization, we call that compassionate curiosity. And that means that when you don't understand something or it doesn't make sense, you don't immediately reject it or have judgments and expectations around it. You try to understand it, you try to learn it, and you try to empathize with it so that you can really create change. I think a lot of DEI efforts, especially in corporate organizations, have become very performative. I know that's a strong thing to say, but I feel very strongly about it. I think we need to stop being defensive about things and creating DEI efforts around that, and instead create more dialogue and more understanding so that we can move away from, here's all this data we've collected and here are the numbers, to here are some stories of how our efforts are changing our culture, right? So that's just my 2 thoughts on that, 2 pieces on that.
And I just wanted to just maybe call in the concept that it isn't strictly a DEI problem, or this isn't really laid at the feet of DEI, because DEI, let's be honest, often those who are sitting in the DEI space of leadership do not actually have power to do anything. They are more, as Khushboo said, performative measures for DEI, things that were put in place to make people happy after the murder of Floyd. So if you don't have real power in your DEI office to actually implement real sustainable change and to move people forward, how could we ever expect DEI to address this? However, this is still a strategy and change management issue if you're looking at remote work. So where are the strategists who should have been thinking about, well, we have a whole new way to work. How are we going to implement this? How are we going to roll this out? How are we going to evaluate and make sure it's effective? So I think it's almost like a two-part issue is, DEI does own a piece of this, but it really doesn't own the whole piece, because it's such a radical change for some of these organizations that were not remote, that someone who was looking at strategy, cost, function, rollout, education, this should have been really a larger lift than it was. Most places were like, we're going to buy some computers and you're going to go home and we're going to buy some type of app for you to communicate through. I don't hear anything in that statement with, well, how are you going to be a member of the team? How are you going to also socialize with your coworkers? How are you going to make sure that you have breaks? Because there is a shift and a learning curve when people go work from home. So I kind of, I lay this right at the feet sometimes of the CFOs and the CEOs, who should have been thinking a little bit differently about where this all sits and wellness of employees.
Yeah,
I'll probably never work again.
I mean, I agree that I think that the remote piece goes like far beyond anything to do with DEI strategy. I think it was almost like an afterthought that it actually does make work more inclusive and potentially, that it is like related to DEI, but I don't think anyone actually like went remote with that being the initial impetus for it. And so I don't think people created great strategies for how to make the workplace like more inclusive, how to support people through that. And I think that's why when I say like there was just a stark difference working for a company designed to be remote, because we had to have a lot of things in place for that. And I don't know I wasn't here from the founding foundation like 10 years ago, but I imagine they went through some learning curves along the way to figure out like what they needed to solve for. And fortunately did that before I got here. But I think it's, I do think it has to like go far beyond that. And I also, to your point, Kush, about like, a lot of like DEI efforts just being performative. I think that's absolutely true. And so often it seems, like we've seen with layoffs in tech that DEI teams have been gutted, and, affected by that, which I think shows like how little that work is valued. It's seen as like an extra versus mission critical. And so until there's like executive sponsorship, until executives are saying like, this is a company-wide priority, I don't really see like DEI having real teeth, like DEI efforts having real teeth to it, because it's always seen as like if we have time for that, if we have extra budget, unless there's again, like executive sponsorship, and unless they're looking at every single strategy in the workplace and saying like, how is this related to DEI? How is this furthering our, making this a more equitable workplace? And if executives are not asking that question of every single executive, like you can't just put it on your 1 or 2 DEI employees. Like it has to be something that every single person has ownership over. And like absent that, I don't think there's going to be much like real progress anywhere.
Two ideas. There were several that were really important, I think, in this discussion, but I think would be interesting to hear just from your experiential perspective of working with others, working with organizations, even within your own. What are the roles of innovation and strategy specifically when we're talking about managing, making decisions, creating systems that actually will support, let's say, hybrid workforces or online workforces? So I'm just, again, taking what you guys talked about, I think you're exactly right. Like, I'll be the first to say, I think that most DEI efforts are a failure because there is no change management strategy, and there is no intersection of exactly what Bonnie was saying, looking at how equity, belonging, and inclusion flow through the policies and processes of an organization. So I'm interested to hear for each of you, if you have maybe even a story of experience to share, but what and how are the roles of innovation and strategy important in thinking about and making moves in this kind of way?
On the front of innovation, I think so often if you will just like include the people experiencing the problems in the solution and just say like, hey, what are the barriers right now? And do you have any ideas on like what you would need or what would help fix this? often like the people experiencing the issues are the ones that are going to have the best solutions. And often they're a lot simpler. I think things get really complicated when a bunch of like high level executives that don't know what's going on the ground think they understand a problem or hear like murmurings of a problem and think the solution is going to be something really complicated or expensive when actually it could be really simple. I'm trying to think, if you've got people like working in office and someone is like ready to quit their job because they can no longer pick their kid up at school, ask that person, hey, like, what do you need to make this happen? Maybe giving them a little bit of money so they can afford a babysitter to get their kid. Maybe saying like, hey, could you, wrap up work from home, save like the email stuff for home, do it while your kid's doing homework. Now you can go get your child, go home and still like get your work day done. Like really simple, low cost solutions that I'm sure and people would generate much better ones than those two. But I just feel like there's so many things like out there that if you just like ask the people experiencing the challenges and engage them in the problem solving, you'll be able to solve them pretty quickly. But often it seems like there's like a lot of gatekeeping, like we have to develop the strategy. It has to be for everyone, like one size fits all. And anytime you're taking that approach, it's going to leave like anyone that's not essentially like a white man, because most of the people designing policies are white men. So they design with like white men as the end user. And so everyone else like is inherently going to be left out unless you're like really pulled in and asked like, what do you need to succeed in this space?
I love that. I wanted to just say that I think what you pointed out, we say this a lot, right? That things were built for white men, but I think it's important to say why that matters, right? I think we can experience it, but there is a reason that matters is because these systems were set up for men who have wives, servants, slaves, assistants that do all the other work and decision making, so they can just make decisions that fit into their box, right? And that is how most our systems have been set up. So I want to just name that because I think that is one of the things we don't get to, which is why this matters, that it was only designed by white men, because they had the rest of us doing all the other work in the world until we decided that that wasn't going to happen anymore and have worked through revolutions and change, right? So I just want to name that. And I think it is so important to that idea of innovation.
I'm glad you pointed that out because I think we forget that we have not. So everybody's upset about inflation now, right? Like we're all like, it's so high, everything costs so much money. But if we think about it, we have not been incrementally increasing pay, looking at the time it takes us to do the work that we do, looking at the things that we've lost as progress and innovation and industry has happened. We don't work the same way we did in the 50s or 40s or even the 70s, right? So people are less likely to have a grandmother who they might have picking up their child because grandma is working longer, because we are all working longer because it is not so much a physical job. So if you don't look at an entire system from top to bottom and say, hey, well, we don't have babysitter services, what's going to replace that? We have more women working, but yet they earn less. How do we fix that? We have two families working. What does that look like to actually have people interact with their children, right? We're all upset when the next generation comes on board and they don't know anything and they haven't been socialized, but we never say, hey, well, did we ever look at the systems that haven't changed since 1910? Like no one goes home and says to their maid, like, hey, good thing the house is clean. Some people do, but most people don't. So if that isn't the way that we work, why are we all not screaming, hey, we don't work like this anymore? We need more services or we need more flexibility in the workday. I don't know how many people feel guilty when they look around their house and they're like, it's so messy, but you spent, so many hours working. We just don't live the same way that we used to. So how are we fixing that? So when you pointed that system out, the system really is very, very fractured and broken. And I'm not sure if government alone can even fix it. It's almost like a government/joint corporation thing. I read something about a company that was able to push faster housing projects because they were a corporation and they knew some workarounds. So maybe this is the time, since we are so behind and where we should have been all along, to say, you know what, this is a global problem. How are we going to fix this with companies, government, policy, and really analyze this whole system, because people are not healthy and we're not preparing future generations for the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of wanted to pull the 2 points together that you both mentioned. Yes, we do need to look at the system and the whole issue as a whole, because without that, there can't be really any solutions. And also that collaborative approach, the people who are impacted by the issue have to be invited to the table. And it doesn't mean getting a consultant from outside. Who are the people within your organization that are facing the issue? How can we get them together? How can we learn, right? And that feedback loop is something that I feel a lot of organizations get afraid of, because they think, oh, if we open up the gate, it's going to be like a floodgate of things that we have to deal with. But that's where the answers are. That's where the solutions are. And that's where the innovation is. So until and unless you invite the people who are sort of having some difficulties with the changes that are happening, you can't begin to learn how to solve that problem. And somebody else is not going to be able to come into your organization and quickly assess that either. So there's no quick fix to it, unfortunately. I think that innovation comes from really sort of thinking through those things that you might not have considered, Bonnie, like you mentioned, and recognizing that if you're trying to change anything, it's not about what you're changing, it's how you do it, right? Where is that communication happening with everyone who's going to be impacted? Where is that feedback loop being introduced? And at what point are we actually assessing for success? And what success looks like for that thing that we're calculating? Because if we don't define these things, then we're just doing things without considering any repercussions of those actions. And yes, there's always going to be someone who's going to have a problem with something, but none of us do work the same way. None of us think the same way. None of us cognitively process information in the same way. None of us experience our environment in the same way. So if you take all of those into consideration, how is it that a one-size-fits-all policy going to keep everyone happy? It's not. So making those quick things and alterations to how you do things and working with the person, I think that's really where that solution will come from.
Okay, I have one last question to kind of round out this discussion, though. Frankly, there's been so many amazing points. I feel like we could dive in and spend some time. So I appreciate everything that you're sharing in this kind of grandiose overview. But I want to talk a little bit about this idea of hybrid, right? What are the best practices for having people work remotely? But also, where is that place for collaboration? And if you do build a hybrid model of having people, both in and out of offices, what is the usefulness of being in an office? I think that's a question I'm hearing all the time from people who are being forced back to work is, well, now I'm going to the office and it's less efficient. I get less work done. I don't feel closer to my colleagues, and we aren't getting any projects accomplished together, right? So I would just love to hear from each of your perspectives, and feel free to take that where you want. What are some of those best practices and important ideas to think about in the relationship of what is great about remote work and what is great about in-person collaboration?
I'm just going to jump in. So when we ended up fully going remote at one organization I was at, one of the things that they did was they continued to do their employee activity groups online, and they continued to offer them in some type of capacity online. They also had their people that were in office test the online versions of it so that you could sort of see, was it as a robust? Did people get to interact? It was open to both. And I think that helped to form the team piece. And you can't just go remote or even hybrid if you're not thinking about the engagement of your employees. It's not going to happen naturally, especially for some who are neurodiverse. I know I really dreaded every time someone would stop by my cubicle when I was in office to just like chat because it threw me completely off. So it was definitely nicer to have some freedom to decide with, with chats like IMs and things like that. But I do think you have to make a conscious effort if you're remote or if you're hybrid to create engagement activities for those who are going to be working from home or hybrid. And a lot of companies don't do that. What they say is everybody is invited to the in-place thing or the live thing, or you go and you realize the sound is really hard to hear. Like there wasn't a lot of thought put into how those who are not present will engage. And that is best practice, is to really think about not just the work that the person is creating, but how will you ensure that they're healthy, that they're engaging with their team. Not only that, but that they're also taking breaks. We know that in many cases, people that work from home actually work longer hours and they work longer without breaks. So can you do a walking meeting with your staff? Because everybody has Zoom on their, like a lot of people have Zoom on their phones. Let's all go for a walk and we'll take this meeting as a walk because it's just a check-in. So what stops you from doing that and also getting steps in? Like what stops us from being truly innovative and like putting out those ideas? Work doesn't have to happen in an office. It can also happen outside. Anyone who's taught at a university has probably taken their students out time outside at some point when it's nice and had a class outside. Why not think of those same things in the workplace, but with remote workers? So those are some things that I've encountered as best practices, and just making it a part of the calendar, like putting it on your HR calendar for activities or whoever's doing your activities, making sure that people can be involved and not holding and also looking at performance evaluations for trends, right? So if you're seeing trends where remote workers do not get the same level of promotions, they don't get the same level of acknowledgement in your organization, and you have a cadre that is, my question would be why? And are you being inclusive? And what would they say about your organization? So there's all different ways we can track this. We have so much technology.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I've been fully remote for the last 3 years and I love it. So I'm a huge proponent of that. But that being said, later this afternoon, I'm actually going to go meet my team at a library as part of a university so that we can have a brainstorming session. And that is one of the ways in which we're making this hybrid model work for us, because we recognize that for something like a brainstorming, we all want to be in the same room so we can work on something collaboratively. And it wouldn't be the same if we tried to do it online. So just recognizing that there are certain things that require that in-person collaboration. But to kind of piggyback off of Tahitia's point is also making those events or those opportunities more inclusive whenever possible. So recognizing like, hey, this person hasn't shared anything in a few minutes. Why don't we ask them what they're thinking? So accommodating those kinds of things so that even in those events, in those opportunities to collaborate, you're improving that psychological safety and basically creating a space for people to be open to share how they feel or even to challenge ideas, because that's so important. And having that opportunity to do that in any setting, whether it's virtual or in person, is just going to improve the culture overall. So I'll leave with that point. Bonnie?
Yeah, I think I think on the making like hybrid work front, I do think the biggest thing is like being strategic about when you need people in the office. Like when I see these mandates that are like, you need to be in office 3 days a week. It's like, to what end? And often those people, like I had a friend who was told that they needed to relocate to like 1,500 miles away for their role. Not a single person on the team that they would be joining actually lived in that location. And there wasn't anything location specific about the role. It was just like, well, that's like the headquarters, or maybe the manager was, I don't know, something like that. But it was like a global team. Anyway, it just made no sense. And I was like trying to wrap my head around like, what is the rationale for this of, so you can go be in an office for 3 days a week and still sit on Zoom. And so I do think that it can make sense if you're strategic about, we're all going to come into the office on this day and we're going to save these types of activities, or we're going to always do our team meeting in that setting. I work for a global company. There's not even another person in my entire state that is on my team. So we can't just all go into the office. And the reality is there's like lots of tools that you can use that enable that collaboration. And if you invest in the tools and resources and train people on how to use them, then I think you can accomplish probably about 95% of the same stuff that you could in person. And even if some of it you lose effectiveness, you have to remember that you're gaining effectiveness in a whole bunch of other areas, or maybe you spend a little bit more time. But hey, you've saved a couple of hours every day on your commute, so you're okay putting that extra time in. And so I think some of it is that like give and take. I also think that if you're hybrid in the way that some people are in office and some are home, you guys already talked about this as well, but the ensuring that you have like technology that puts the experience of everyone puts everyone on a level playing field. So it's not like, oh, those of you that aren't here are watching on a screen. There's no audio for you to communicate. So you're just getting, while the people that are there in person are getting to engage, and you're this like outsider. No, there need to be ways for everyone to engage equally. And I think even for my team, we do retreats annually. We have a company retreat, and then teams can get together. There's always a virtual option for every single one. And I had to go virtual because I had got COVID during one back in October. So I had to join virtually. And, for every session, there was so much like energy put into making sure that our access was the same. We were always asked like, what questions do you all have? And our questions could be heard by everyone. We were able to engage with everyone that was like present in the room in the same way. And so it does take more money and more resources and more thought to make sure you have the technology to do that. But that is like what you need to do to manage either a hybrid or a remote workforce effectively. And the other thing that I think is really important is that you teach people the rules of how to engage. And I think this is true for any setting in anywhere. I just don't think we do enough to make the implicit stuff explicit. So the people who grew up in the right environment based on whoever's setting the rules just inherently know how to engage, and no one else does. And so I think especially working globally, where some people could be working in like a primarily US environment for the first time, they're working in a language that's not their first or even second language, like all those different barriers that come up, you have to teach people just act like we don't know anything. And that is like what I've really appreciated coming to Zapier is like from day one, it was like, hey, here's the kind of stuff you put in Slack. Here's what you put in email. Here's like some of the tricks of how we use Slack. Here is like how we put the main idea here and we comment underneath, like literally every little thing. But then I was never guessing. I wasn't having to like watch from the outside, try to figure out how do I engage in this conversation, because it was clear. We have style and tone guides so that I know like, here's kind of how we generally talk to each other. It's like, okay to make these kinds of you were not expected to communicate in complete sentences. You don't need to put forth formal memos for things like all that stuff, because otherwise people are guessing, and that's what stops people from engaging or feeling in, because they're watching. We get dictionaries of all the language you might hear. They even have a list of inside jokes that have developed over time so that I know why our colors were picked and how, and like all this random stuff, because they don't want you to feel left out as like a new employee because you weren't here for all the stuff that came before. So it was a lot to read through as a new employee, but I really felt from like my first week, I was like, oh, I can like engage here because I feel like I know what's been going on. And
I love that.
it's the first time I've ever experienced that in my career.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think I've ever experienced that full package of onboarding, inclusion, understanding in any workplace except for one university. And then even there, it was so daunting the way they did it that people just kind of, did what they had to do to get to pass that check and move on. So very different. We are wrapping up our time together. Thank you so much for being here. As we depart, I wanted to just ask if there was one last poignant idea that each of you would like to say or end on as, wrapping up this conversation and leaving others to think about it.
So this is more of something that I had read when you first sent me this. I know there's a lot of news and media out there saying that working from home isn't necessarily healthy for individuals. That information from everything that I sort of looked at seems to be dependent on where you're looking. So I can, just like any stats, I can take it and manipulate it as I please. But after what Bonnie said, one of the things that I read was that Generation Z is having a harder time onboarding, but Generation Z and millennials have often been treated as figure it out a lot of times yourself in the workplace because they've come from most of the time two working parents. So what would it look like if the world looked like Bonnie's workplace, where you actually thought about, how do I describe this to someone who has never worked here before? Because we don't think about that often when we talk about jobs. No one is born for the job that they are in at a workplace. Everyone needs training and the time to go through that. And, I really think some of the data out there is a little false because it doesn't look at, well, how were people onboarded and were they onboarded inclusively from an equity perspective, thinking about as generational learners, do they learn differently? Have they been socialized differently? Just as you said, Bonnie. So I love you said that. That's the one thing I'll end on because it would make us healthier if we were able to really, because I'm sure as a first time worker, a Gen Zer, if you get dismissed because you're not able to onboard, I can't imagine what that does to your psyche. Like that just has to be devastating because your employer didn't invest the time to start you off right.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, in our program, we call that the hidden curriculum of the workplace. It's just like around the water cooler, like people just know this, right? And I work a lot with my students who are neurodivergent job seekers to try to give them more context about things so that they have some base level of understanding, because many of them have never worked before. That being said, I think, just to kind of overall leave with one statement, I did want to say that when we are trying to foster a healthy working environment, no matter what industry, no matter what size of organization, I just don't think it's possible by saying one size fits all. It's just impossible. And so just recognizing where can we question the whys and the hows of that to make it better. So I'll leave at that point.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation, and I think lots of interesting insights and perspectives. I think the comment around just making sure that we are considering kind of how the system evolved to be like what it is, and just how interconnected this isn't like a workplace issue. It is like a culture issue, and lots of the challenges that we're experiencing, probably more of it feels more visible in the US. It's everywhere, but feels really visible to us living here. But they're all interconnected, and so it's not like something that can be solely solved by the government or solely solved by one policy or by a great CEO. Like there's just a lot of different things like at play. But I think the other thing I think a lot about is like any change, any evolution is hard. And so I think a lot of like the pushback is very normal against like remote work and against like, DEI practices in general, like it's very normal for people to push back because anytime there's change, you're giving up some level of power or comfort, or the environment that has let you be successful is suddenly no longer there. And now you have to figure out how to be successful in a new space. And that's all really hard. So I also just remember, like, try to have empathy and remember that a lot of this is a normal process. But I'm hopeful that with continued conversations that we're able to see the evolutions that need to happen in the workplace, because I do think these are ultimately things that are going to make it easier for people from underrepresented backgrounds to find themselves more represented in the workplace.
And if not, they'll just keep leaving the way that they are and starting their own companies and hopefully beating out these others. So on that note, thank you all for being here. I think this is a beautiful way to conclude this. This is about this collective shift of change that we're trying to work towards. How do we see our own space in that? How do we participate in that? Understand that this is intergenerational. This is societal, and it's structures that were made without us, before us. So how do we want to start recreating those together? Thank you for being here, and I appreciate each of your thoughts. I hope that we will continue to discuss this and these other topics in other manners soon. Thank you.